Well, we are live once again with the Emissary Publishing Podcast with my good friend and colleague, Paul, and today's special guest, Rabbi Goldson. Paul, good to see you, buddy.
Good to see you, Jason. I've been looking forward to this. I've known Rabbi for a couple of years, and I've had no small amount of great discussions about great ideas with him. That's what he excels at. And but today we're going to do a little play on words with some of the things that he's famous for saying, as well as one of my favorite books from ancient Jewish wisdom, which is called The Ethics of the Fathers. But today we're going to talk about the ethics of the authors. We're going to talk about something that you and I do day in and day out at Emissary, and that is helping faith-based founders spread messages that matter. And we've brought in Rabbi as an expert on the ethics of ideas worth sharing. He has a TED Talk to that effect. You can look it up on his website. But there's so much to get to, so we better not stay here too long, and we better bring in our honored guest. Let's bring in the Rabbi. Shalom, Rabbi. How are you?
I am well, Paul. Thank you. And hello, Jason.
Hello, good to meet you. This is going to be exciting. I did a little bit of background research on you, and I'm super curious. The ethics ninja, and you got a TED Talk out there. That's bold. That's bold stuff. And so I'm super excited to go through this conversation with you.
Well, it's like many things. There's an evolution there. Went from being the ethics maven to the ethics warrior. And I couldn't find one that really, really resonated until the idea was either popped into or was placed into my head, ethics ninja, because it sounds a little bit like an oxymoron. We think of the ninja as being assassins and stealthy, but the ninjas live in the gray areas. They live in the shadows. And that's where ethics really is relevant. My book and my podcast are both called Grappling with the Gray, because when it's black or it's white, that's not too tough. And so much of life is gray. And that's where we have to always be shifting our balance, looking for enemies, and plotting our course of sometimes defense, sometimes attack.
Wow. All right. Well, let's get into this.
And Rabbi, you've also got a new book out that I'd want everybody to know about, which I've been in the middle of reading, called The Spiral of Time. And just a little bit of brief background on what that's about too, before we get much further.
By a happy coincidence, I just happen to have a copy here that I'm holding up for the camera. This actually, people say, how long did this book take to write? And it's about 30 years, because it's a collection of essays. And it focuses on, or it follows really, the Jewish calendar. And it's not written exclusively for Jews, because we are all travelers through time. And the Jewish holidays are designed to help us focus on different core principles at various times that those principles are manifest in the nature of the universe, the nature of the world. So the stories that I tell, some are historical, some are philosophical, some are personal, but they all relate to our passage through life. And it's not a circle, because we never come back to exactly the same point. But we do cross the same axes again and again and again. And we hope that every time we do, we've grown a little, we've learned a little more, we're a little bit better than we were last time we passed through that point in time. And over the course of our lives, we try to spiral outward and upward, continuously learning, continuously growing, and continuously making more and more important, positive contributions to the world we live in.
Wow.
And of course, no matter how much mastery you achieve in one area, it's always good to be reminded that there are other areas where you're still in kindergarten and need to grow.
Yeah, they say that baseball players often play golf in their time off, not just for fun, but because it works different muscles. And that if you're only working the muscles that you want to use, you're not developing your entire body. And so sometimes physically you have to develop those other muscles, even though they're not the ones you need for your main sport, just to keep your body in balance. Well, the same thing goes minds and our spirits.
How true that is. True story for me. Um, it's a topic for another time. We want to dig into something that I think you'll be able to comment on extensively, Rabbi. For us, right, an emissary, it's brand central. It's helping faith-based founders spread messages that matter. And you've done this talk about ideas worth sharing. And I'm curious, examples, the philosophical underpinnings that you've been able to put together that might help an author or a potential author watching this say, you know what? It's time I looked at this a little bit closer. It's time I stopped sitting on the sidelines, and it's time I started spreading the message that I've received that's unique to me.
Well, that could keep us busy for a while. You mentioned ideas worth spreading, which of course is the TED logo, and every TED Talk is supposed to be designed around a new idea. Well, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of TED Talks there are out there, but I'm willing to wager that there are no more new ideas. And it's not just because of TED. And King Solomon tells us there's nothing new under the sun. So it's not our job to come up with new ideas. It's our job to come up with new ways of looking at old ideas. And what writers get told so often is write what you know. And there's a tremendous amount of wisdom in that on a variety of levels. If I'm not an expert in something, I probably don't have much business pontificating about it. But on a more, I don't know, maybe pedestrian level, what I try to do is I try to take my stories and make them your story, make them the reader's story. What makes a story compelling is when it happened to me. It's my own personal experience. And then I widen my experience to include you in the story. I show how my story is also your story. So then you have the personal element, you have that emotional element, and you have the wider significance of it. If I'm just talking about myself, nobody really wants to hear me do that. If I'm talking about other people, well, you don't need me to do that because they can speak for themselves. But if I can take my story and I can demonstrate how it's really all our story, then that's a very powerful method of connecting with people. And if it's something that inspires me, then I can project that inspiration to others. Maybe just add one more point is it doesn't always have to be my story per se. Another approach I take is when I read the news, which is of dubious value in general, but it's good to know what's going on in the world. And whenever there's a story that really resonates with me, I say, well, why is that resonating? What's the deeper message in that? So, for instance, one of my favorite stories was about how New York City tried to impose a congestion pricing tax. Forget exactly what they call it. The idea was to make it disadvantageous to drive through Manhattan. And it was just about to pass. It had been used in other cities, London, I think, and I forget where else. And it was all ready to go, and everybody was on board. And then they started getting pushback, and eventually it fell through. Well, not long after that, gas prices soared, and all of a sudden, the same effect was achieved in a different way, and they were able to chart how driving through Manhattan suddenly fell off because people were looking for alternative routes, alternative forms of transportation. And what did I see in this? I saw how Providence puts obstacles in our paths, and we have to look for how to navigate around those obstacles. Because often, instead of looking at them as inconveniences, we could be looking at them as messages on how to find a better way forward, how to make more progress, how to be more efficient with our time. So that's one example of looking at what goes on in the world and finding a message that we can all relate to.
Well, one of the things that's connecting with me out of what you're talking about is the matter of relationships and relationship discussions, perhaps between spouses. The principles of maintaining a relationship have been laid down for thousands of years. And yet, everyone who enters a relationship suddenly in a way providentially stumbles upon opportunities to apply, even learn and then apply the principles, which are not new, and yet they are new and being learned. And it's one thing to know, it's one thing to read, it's one thing to study, and it's a not entirely different thing to apply. And there's a book that I was reading some time ago, and one of the things it talked about was, like, during conversations, knowing what not to say is as important and sometimes more important than knowing what to say. And yet, saying that's like, well, yeah, we know that. The application of that is a lifetime to master, you know, and then some, which gets back to, I think, some of the things you're talking about in the gray area. The application of some of these principles in an individual situation is not easy. And it's much more art than science.
Yeah, and that's the wonderful thing about story, is that story appeals to both the intellect and the emotion,
Mm.
because neither one alone is enough.
Yes.
And I've only been married for 36 years. I'm still trying to figure it out. So I don't call myself an expert on marriage, but I will. I'll go against what I just said a moment ago and quote a story from my friend Sam Artery, who's a mediation expert. He's been on my podcast a number of times, and he has a story I just love, that he was in an argument with his wife, and being trained as a lawyer, he was very effective at arguing his point. At which point, after a while, his wife said, "Sam, do you want to be right or do you want to be married?" And it's a short, powerful story, because if you've studied history, there's such a thing as a Pyrrhic victory, where you can win the battle, and the cost of winning the battle is so high that you end up losing the war. We all have egos, and we all want to be right, and it can be very expensive to be right. Recognizing that there may be other legitimate points of view, there may be other factors involved. It is that art that you were describing, Jason, to really feel our way through, as well as think our way through any type of interpersonal situation.
And I think that underscores the importance of looking backward through time and learning from one another, uncovering these tried and true principles. I feel like they sort of give it's like a keel on a boat, and that ballast that keeps that boat upright and keeps it aligned to where you want it to go. And that takes time to develop, and it takes experience, much more than we can have in a lifetime. And yet it's sort of incumbent upon us and folks like yourselves, that we bring those learnings into the present and overlap our lives with someone else's, and walk with that individual. Because one of the things that comes to my mind is the idea, you've got ethics ninja. A ninja's not developed on his own. It's that individual is developed by a process of perhaps discipleship, if you'd like to call it that, where we walk with another person over time to learn the things, the principles that have been laid down for generations, perhaps.
Yeah, that apprenticeship is absolutely critical. The sages teach that Joshua was not the greatest sage of his generation, but he was the one who spent the most time around Moses, who was the greatest leader, not just of his generation, but of any generation. And he wasn't training to be a successor. His idea was, I want to be the best person I can be, so I'm going to hang out with the best person I know. And he basically earned the privilege of being the attendant of Moses, and through years and years and years of proximity, he developed into the greatest candidate to be successor to Moses. These kinds of stories, you talk about the past pointing us into the future. I read a book called Dawn to Destiny, an overview of Jewish history. And I start off with a story just like that a fellow is traveling from Jerusalem to Tiberias, and he comes to a crossroads, and there's one of these directional signs with the arrows pointing, except it's lying on the ground. So that's not terribly helpful. Well, he picks it up. There's no way to know which road is where the Tiberias arrow should point, but he knows where he came from.
Mm.
So he points the Jerusalem arrow back the way he came, and now he's able to figure out which path he's supposed to take moving forward. When we learn history, we study it, and we understand the stories of history, then we now are armed with information and templates, as you so to speak, to guide us to deal with situations as they arrive moving into the future.
Wow.
And as this happens, Rabbi, this is where I connect. This is my connection point for the obligation. I think a lot of the people that we would want to work with are wrestling with. It's like I have all this experience. I have all these stories. I've learned all these lessons. And I don't want it to die with me. But if they're but they hesitate. We encounter all sorts of people who hesitate for all sorts of reasons. When you were, just to make it personal, tell us a little bit about like when you first decided to become an author. How big of a challenge was it for you? What did you wrestle with or have to overcome to get from zero to publish the first time?
I mean, might not be the best person to ask that. I was writing stories when I was 7 years old.
Okay.
It's just the way I'm wired. However, we're all familiar with this 10,000 hour principle. How do you become a good writer? Write. Just write. I have several unpublished novels that quite possibly will remain unpublished. And it doesn't really bother me because the process, the countless hours I put into those works made me a better writer. And in fact, when I published The Spiral of Time, which just came out this year, it's a collection I mentioned of essays that I'd written over the course of many, many years. I went back and freshened a lot of them up because I'm a better writer now than I was when I wrote them the first time, when I published them the first time. And I should be.
Right.
Because every time you write, you get a little bit better. Like every time you do anything, you get better. So the starting point is just write.
Yeah.
A page a day, a paragraph a day, an hour a day, 15 minutes a day, whatever you can do, just write and write the story of your life. The worst thing that'll happen is nobody will read it. And you'll become a better writer while you're doing it. You may have children or grandchildren that will want to read it one day, to know about you, to know about your life, to understand where you came from and what you were all about. And you may discover stories as you write that you've forgotten about, or you've forgotten the significance of them. And those might turn into essays. They might turn into speeches, or it doesn't matter. There's something cathartic about writing. That it's a wonderful form of therapy, even if you never publish. It's a wonderful, wonderful gift. The gift of words, the gift of language, the gift of story and idea. It's not something to take lightly.
Well, it recalls to my mind the saying that experience is the best teacher, and how that's a bit incomplete, because there are many people who have a lot of experience and have seemingly learned nothing. And it's really that evaluated experience is the best teacher. And I think the part of the process of writing is to bring forth our thoughts onto the page so that we can evaluate what we really are thinking, what really matters. What are these new connections? And I love how you talked about you wrote one thing and then you freshened it up at a future date. You applied new learning to something that is still valuable to you, but perhaps you're expressing it or evaluating it in a different way years in the future.
Yeah, and in fact, and just to develop the idea further, I think better at the keyboard.
Hmm.
I'm constantly quoting George Orwell, who said that, among other things, that if thought can corrupt language, then language can corrupt thought.
Hmm.
And if we don't use words properly, then our thoughts are going to be muddled because we think in words.
Yeah.
So developing a better command of the language, but to simply be inside my own head, thoughts don't coalesce, they don't concretize. And by being forced to put them down, there are studies that say it's actually better to write with a pen or pencil on paper. I'll leave that to individuals because I find I operate better at a keyboard. But whatever works for you, it doesn't matter. It's putting the ideas into words and seeing them appear before your eyes, reading them over. And then as a reader, is this coherent? Is it as clear as it could be? Is it as concise as it should be? There's so much of a process that goes. E.B. White, arguably one of the greatest writers in American history, he said, "I'm not such a great writer, but I'm a pretty good rewriter." The process of revision is critical. I mean, Mozart was able to put down his finished draft the first time, but I don't know if there's anybody else in history who could. I remember going to the old books section of the Washington University Library here in St. Louis, and there was an open book under glass, an original manuscript by Alexander Pope, who was one of my favorite poets when I was studying English in college. And I was just mesmerized. And I look down and I see cross-outs and and revisions in the margins. I mean, here's one of the greatest masters of English literature of all time, and he just struggled through it like the rest of us.
Yeah,
it's a labor of discipline and it's a labor of love.
that's huge, Rabbi. I've taught my team about that. I've tried, and it takes them a little while, but they get it eventually. If you go back and read out loud what you've written, your ears will pick up so much that your eyes miss. And just a little editing tip for those of you listening, but in the interest of time, it's time for me and Jason to be dragged across the coals here by one of Rabbi's. It's time for the ethical challenge. So we invited Rabbi Goldson to throw out one of his infamous ethical conundrums. You want to know what it's like to grow up as a Jewish child going to yeshiva, where the rabbi sits down in front of you and throws out questions. Okay, kids, what do we do here? We're going to do an adult version of it here. And Rabbi, I'm gonna invite you to take the floor and throw out an ethical conundrum, and then Jason and I will duke it out.
Okay, well, I'm glad you gave me a little bit of notice. This is my book, Grappling with the Gray, which is also the title of my podcast, which you've been on a number of times, Paul. And I convene a panel, and I give them an ethical scenario. So I'm going to read you straight out of the book and see what you do with this. In July 1977, a lightning strike in Westchester County set off a power outage that plunged New York City into 25 hours of darkness. Flights were canceled, baseball games suspended, and subway trains ground to a halt. Looting spread through neighborhoods in Brooklyn and the Bronx, along with hundreds of fires set by arsonists. Imagine that you were walking from your office in Brooklyn to catch the subway home when the lights went out. Within moments, you hear the sound of shattering glass and see flames rising up into the sky. A taxi pulls up beside you and the cabbie yells, "You want to get out of here?" It's a $30 ride home, but you consider it a bargain. As you climb in, the driver says, "For $100, I'll take you wherever you want to go." The crowd seemed to be growing more unruly by the moment. "All right," you say, whatever you want. When the cabbie pulls up in front of your house, you say, listen, I'll pay you the regular fare, and I'll even give you a tip, but I'm not paying you $100. That's extortion. A deal's a deal, the cabbie replies. You agree to the price. You have to pay. Who's right?
I have a feeling I know what Jason's going to say, but I'm not going to say what he's going to say. I'll just say that to me, if I agreed to $100 to get home, I'd feel bad about it, but I would pay it.
Yeah, I think it might be extortion, but I agreed to it. And given the situation, why not? I mean, I'll lose $100 doing something foolish. So from a value perspective, it's like, okay, well, fine. That's where I would land on that.
So the real benefit of these scenarios is to explore the different options, as opposed to I think the French philosopher Joseph Joubert said it's better to debate an issue without settling it than to settle it without debating it. So we generally have this idea one should always keep one's word. But when someone takes advantage of our integrity to put us in a situation that is unjust, is there an argument to be made that it might be demonstrative of greater integrity to not keep one's word? Perhaps you are encouraging immoral or unethical behavior. In fact, in Torah law, there is a similar scenario that if a person is being chased by someone who wants to kill him, and he gets to a ferry, and the ferryman wants to double the price to take him across, and he agrees to it, when he gets to the other side, he's not obligated to pay the ferryman twice the fare, because the ferryman had an obligation to help this fellow save his life. He's entitled to his regular fare. He doesn't have to do it for free. But to take advantage of a person in a moment of desperation is itself profoundly unethical.
Yeah.
So what you're really looking at is you're looking at a conflict of two values. There's the value to tell the truth and to keep your word. And there's the value to maintain the social responsibility that a successful, healthy society relies on. And there isn't necessarily a right or a wrong answer here.
Yeah.
Anytime you have competing values, then we have to start prioritizing which value comes first.
Well, and that underscores the nature of the gray, like you're talking about, because in that specific situation, while I would be very unhappy to take another ride with that individual, I would not do business with that person. Perhaps would I let him get me out of a bind now? For sure, because I don't have any other options. However, I'm not going to make a habit of that. So it's kind of like the fool me once, shame on you; fool me twice, shame on me. And I think also one of the things that brings up in my mind is know whether that action, whatever action, however you're reasoning it, is leading you to what your end result. What end result are you really looking for? Back to your friend. Hey, are you looking to be right? Are you looking to be married? You may at that point in time go, you know what? I don't need to be right now. I'm not going to take exception with this, because that doesn't lead me to, it's not a battle I need to fight on my way to win the war. I'm going to pass on by.
Could also be just what's your financial situation right now?
Yeah.
How desperately do you need that other $70? Could become a factor as well. And there's another story. This one's from the Talmudic era. A sage was praying, and a merchant came up didn't realize that the sage was still involved in his prayers. The prayers were over, but the sage, he was going long. And so the merchant says, I heard you came into possession of a valuable diamond. And he offered him a price. Well, the rabbi didn't respond because he didn't want to interrupt his prayers. So the merchant assumed that his price was too low. And the rabbi just wasn't giving him attention. So he raised the price. He offered him more. Didn't respond. He raised the price again. Then the rabbi finished davening, finished praying, and he said, I'll sell you the diamond, but I'll sell it to you at the first price you mentioned. Because when I heard you offer that price, I made up in my mind that was a fair price and I would sell it. And the only reason I didn't answer is because I was in the middle of my prayers and didn't want to interrupt. So on that, the sages say that this rabbi was under no obligation to not accept the higher offer. Because there had been no deal. The person offered it under his free will, even though it was under a misconception. But for his own personal integrity, the rabbi did not want to take more than the price that he agreed on in his own mind. So there may be times when we set standards for ourselves that may be higher than they would need to be for the population at large.
You know, Rabbi, a couple of weeks ago, we were bantering back and forth on LinkedIn about the whole New York Times versus Sullivan, the libel and libel laws as it relates to public figures and all of that. And the way it went reminds me, it's sort of dovetailing with this, because the question in my mind from the taxi cab scenario is, when I'm being taken advantage of, right? When someone is taking advantage of my integrity, what does that, not does it give me justification to retaliate or anything like that, but what does it open them up to? What, or in other words, what do we as human beings expose ourselves to by dealing underhandedly or dishonestly with people like that? Because with the New York Times versus Sullivan thing, right? The plaintiff was the segregationist southern states who were abusing and mistreating people purely on superficial characteristics. In that case, they were ethically compromised before they ever got to the Supreme Court. But by ruling the way they did, now we've got a sweeping precedent that disqualifies everybody who comes with a libel, an accusation of libel, unless they can actually produce physical proof that, that people intended to libel or slander them. And that's where I feel that, that the reaction was justified in 1964 to that particular defendant, but there are plenty of other people who have paid a price for it because now we're applying that standard universally. And
yeah, so we could find countless examples of laws that were either well-intentioned or were actually quite appropriate for one time, but then time marched on, and the laws are no longer beneficial the way they were written. That becomes a responsibility of lawmakers if we want to put that concept back into our writing. I'm reading right now. I'm reading a Raymond Chandler novel. The original hard-boiled detective, and I'm thinking, boy, you could not write this stuff today. It's the language he uses, the way he talks about women, the way he talks about ethnicities. This would be banned from any book list or from any public library. At the time he wrote it, there was absolutely nothing objectionable based on the standards of society. So on the one hand, I can read it with an understanding that 80 years ago, this was considered acceptable, and at the same time, be sensitive that it's not proper for the time we live in now. And as writers, you can't necessarily anticipate what the world sensitivities are going to be a century in the future.
Yeah.
But you can be sensitive to how people might interpret your words, what they might read into your words. The term self-censorship is a buzzword these days.
Yeah.
And one should not self-censor out of fear. I'm afraid that people will not like what I'm saying, won't like my ideas, but I should self-censor out of sensitivity and awareness.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, I want people to be receptive to what I'm writing. And therefore, I have to put myself inside their heads and anticipate how my words are going to sound. It goes back to that again, right? Do I want to be right or do I want to be read?
Particularly when, I've educated many authors on this, when you're writing, you lose eye contact, body language, tonality, right? Nobody knows any of that. If they're a stranger picking up your book, none of that occurs to them. They have to sort of begin to feel their way towards it through how you construct the stories and the lessons that you learn.
We really have to, they say that you've probably heard this idea that only 7% of communication is verbal.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably not accurate in any case, but it certainly is not accurate with the written word.
Yeah.
Because, as you say, there's so much context that's missing. And so, and then, you mentioned earlier, reading out loud, also letting other people read your stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Because, it may make perfect sense to me, where somebody else reads it and goes, what's going on here?
Worked on a few projects like that. Yeah. This has been great, Rabbi. Let's make sure the audience one more time knows where to go to find you, and what sort of resources can they look forward to? Besides, we've got the Spiral of Time, we've got Grappling with the Gray, the book. There's your podcast. What other resources do you have available for people to dig into the world of ethics?
Well, I put out a lot of content. I have videos, interviews like this one, number of books, and very active on LinkedIn. And I invite readers to reach out. I do have other resources available. I've got a white paper, I have an infographic, ebooks. I have a lot of memes on Instagram. And everything can be accessed either through my name, Rabbi Goldson, or through Ethics Ninja.
All right. ethicsninja.com. Go check out Rabbi Yonason Goldson. Rabbi, it's been so good having you on the Emissary Publishing podcast, and we'd look forward to having you back again sometime soon.
Look forward to it. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.